Good morning, students. Welcome to Organizational Communication 320. My name is Ken Worley. I'm your professor for this course. And as you can see, later on sometime this year, I'm going to do my best to get all three of my young granddaughters to believe that I'm Santa Claus. And so I'm working early, even though it's a while away for me to get ready for that. And I am looking forward to the next 8 weeks of us being together in this course. And so let's go ahead and get started on week one of organizational communication. So I'm going to share my screen here now. And let's see. All right, here we go. All right. Week one. Each of you is on a journey toward your bachelor's in organizational management. And this particular course will help you in that journey. This course, as I said a little while ago, is organizational communication. And as the course suggests, organizational communication is about all the diverse forms of communicating in today's workplace. You might be a pastor, you might be a missionary, you might be a businesswoman, you might be an organizational leader of some kind, or you might be just fresh and out of high school and you're trying to figure out which of those you want to be within your lifetime. So you might have a number of different roles that you've already been in, or you might be looking forward to other roles that you haven't even experienced yet. But whatever your role, you will need knowledge, skills, abilities, and other attributes that are specifically related to you being an excellent communicator. So let's look at what a definition might be. This is my own definition of the course. This is a definition of organizational communication. And here's what it says. It's the exchange of knowledge, thoughts, and ideas among organizationally affiliated individuals and groups through various channels of interaction. So this could be one-on-one interaction, which would be interpersonal. This could be a group or a team that is working together, or it might be communication that is going to go on throughout the entire organization, or it might be communication that is coming from your organization out into society, into the marketplace. The first week, we're going to look at organizational communication challenges, and there are a number of them in today's culture and society. So let's look to the sacred scriptures for an example of what successful organizational communication might look like. King David, even with his human flaws, was considered to be a successful leader, including his ability to communicate with individuals, groups, and the entire nation of Israel, sometimes even communicating to other nations from the nation of Israel as its leader. Much like today, we would refer to someone being a president or a prime minister, but the kings had obviously a lot more autonomy and a lot more power back in those days. And I'm giving you two different translations of this passage of scripture, and they're both pretty fascinating. In the first one, the New Living Translation, it says about King David, he cared for them, meaning the people of Israel, with a true heart, and he led them with skillful hands. Notice the connection there. So, one part of his organizational leadership had to do with him caring for people. Well, if you're going to care for people, you have to have wise ways of communicating that, right? I mean, you know, in your own relationships, if somebody really cares about you, it's important to you that they communicate that to you. And it's important for you to communicate to other people that you care about them, right? It's not enough that we just thought it or that we just felt it. We have to find creative ways to actually communicate that to the people that we care about. And then it says he led them with skillful hands. So notice that one part of David was something that had to do with his integrity, his character, his giftings that were inside of him, and his passions. The other part was skill, and skill is acquired. It's not a natural gift that we have. It means it's something that we developed and became good at over a period of time. Another translation, the NIV, it says about David that he shepherded them. So he cared for them, it says in one translation. Another translation, it says that he shepherded them. And he did it with integrity of heart, true heart or integrity of heart. And with skillful hands, he led them. What a great model for us to look at how someone can navigate the challenges within an organization and do so with character, integrity, honesty, and then also continue to grow in our skill sets while we are communicating with people within our organization, or in David's case, to an entire nation. So let's look at some of the challenges. I mean, what might those be? During this first week of the course, we're going to look at some of the challenges that individuals, groups, and entire organizations face regarding the exchange of communicating with one another and doing it in a successful way. So let's look at some of these challenges and let's name them. Globalization. We are now living in a society where we have t-shirts that you might buy on Amazon or buy at a local store, and you might purchase them from an American company, but as soon as you look at the labeling, you're going to see that many of the products, sometimes all of the products, depending on the company, were actually made in another nation. So that's an example of globalization. The product here, owned by an American company, is actually outsourced to another company in another country. And now you've got multinational and international exchange going on within that. I can order something at Amazon, hope that it's at my house in the next 24 to 48 hours, but it may have been someone in Korea, might be someone in Europe, it might be someone in China that actually assembled it or made it in some way or another. That's an example, just one example, but it's an example of globalization. You also have the multicultural, multinational, and multi-generational, and even the subcultures that are inside of larger cultures. One of the stereotypes for our Asian friends and family is that everybody assumes that all Asian cultures are exactly the same, or that even inside of an Asian culture, that everybody inside of that culture all see everything exactly the same way. Well, that is simply isn't true, right? Look at America. We have people from multiple generations, and then we also have people from subcultures within certain regions. Somebody in New York City has a different accent than someone from Alabama or Georgia. Someone that is 85 years of age has a different perspective than someone that is 15. Someone that is born and raised on Hawaiian Islands is going to have a different perspective than somebody from Alaska, right? So we have all these different factors that come into play that are constantly a part of the landscape that we need to look at regarding communicating within and even from, in other words, without our communication. And so we've got generalization cohorts. We've got transmission models of communication we're going to look at this first week. We're going to look at a constitutive model for organizational communication. We're going to look at a terminology and a phrase referred to as requisite variety regarding communication. We're going to look at the research that a man by the name of Robert Craig did that has a huge impact on the entire scope and sequence of organizational communication. And Robert's development or his research came out publicly in 1999, and he's going to show us, or we're going to look at it in this first week, 7 different ways of how communication works within an organization. Okay. Now, looking at the challenges of communication, as I mentioned a minute ago, generational and cultural cohorts. Well, let's look at those as an example. You've got various generational, cultural, and subcultural experiences. And within those, they all account for different perspectives in life and of life. And therefore, that comes to bear on the workplace, right? The individual lives at home. They may speak a particular language that is dominant in their home, and then they go to work and they have to speak a different language. It's required of them in some form or another in order for them to communicate at work. That's one example of this. So let's look at generational cultures just for a minute. And we're calling them cohorts because just like you're in a cohort right now going to school, you've got different groups of people that grew up in different eras of approximately 20 years is approximately what a generation is considered to be. And every one of those groups of people experienced certain things within the time frame of when they were kids and teenagers and young adults that affected positively or negatively, or actually both, their perspectives, their viewpoints, their point of view, if you will, on life. So some examples are the World War II cohort. My parents grew up as children during World War II. So there was a lot uh, of careful management of resources. They didn't take it for granted if they had light. They didn't take it for granted if they had gasoline. They didn't take food for granted. They were much more conservative and careful with what they did, unlike many of us today, where we know we can go through a drive-through line and count whatever we want. It wasn't like that for them back in the 1940s. My parents were born in 1938, both of them. And so they were young kids during World War II, but they were around and have memories of their lives and how their parents saw things. And it's quite different than how the generations later and even before them saw things. Um, you've got the baby boomers, which is my generation. Boomers were born anywhere from 1946 to 1964. I was born in 1960, so you can see how young I am right now. And that helps me with my Santa Claus beard and getting ready for it, right? So all three of my children now were born in the cohort that sometimes has a negative connotation to it. They're referred to as the millennial generation, and that generation many times gets a bad rap and gets treated as if all of them are lazy, that they don't really want to do a good job at work. And the irony of that is all three of my kids are very hard workers, and they don't like that stereotype that is laid upon the millennial generation. Then you've got Gen Y, you've got Gen Z, you've also got Gen X, which is the generation right after mine. Like I said, that the baby boomer cohort ends at 1964. I was born in 1960. So kids that were born in 1965 and beyond that, and then all the way through the 70s in particular, they were referred to as Gen X. And so many of my friends come from that Gen X cohort, and each generation experienced things in a different way. Everyone that's in this cohort, I'm sure, has heard about 9/11, but how many of you weren't even alive when 9/11 actually happened in 2001? Or you were very young when it happened. I was already an adult and married and had three children when 9/11 happened, but my kids were young. So my children were born in 1988, 1999, and 1993. So they were young when 9/11 happened in 2001 on September 11th. But it has impacted how they view life because they knew that experience happened at and it impacted on a global scale. So you've got uniquenesses that happen within all these different generations. And so I'm going to give you an example. I was just young enough to miss the military draft, and it was required of every young man that as soon as they turned 18, they had to go register for the draft. and then they would just sit and wait, unfortunately, to see whether or not they were picked. I was old enough to need to register for the draft, but the Vietnam War ended before I was ever old enough to actually get drafted. And yet there were young men that were just a few years older than me, and they got drafted. Many of them died in the Vietnam conflict and never got to experience having a family, going to college, having a career and a job. And yet here I was, just a few years younger than them, and my worldview, my point of view, is very different than theirs, even on how many of them see government, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of pain involved for a lot of people in that. And yet, those are not my personal experiences. Um, so, my experience was very different than theirs, even though I was only a few years younger than them. Generational experiences can be related to when and where even that natural disasters might happen. If somebody grew up in flood country or hurricane country or earthquake country, tornado country, and then when massive experiences related to with one of those natural disasters has taken place, it can have a large impact on how people view life. What about when and where changes happen in the economy or the cost of living, or when educational experiences or opportunities or restrictions take place? I was in junior high in 1973 when there was a gasoline shortage, and people had to wait in long lines just to get to the gas pump. And people were getting in physical fights about who was next in line. People were hurt. Some were killed in the middle of those gas wars. And so it was a major hassle just to get a tank of gas and be able to go somewhere. Today, we don't have fights over long lines at the gas pump, but we do have incredibly expensive prices to go get a tank of gas. So for very different reasons, it's caused concerns. But generationally, their experiences were similar if they were within a cohort of people that were growing up at about the same time that someone else was. What about when and where terrorism takes place, whether it be nationally, as we mentioned at 9/11, or even at the local school level, where on school campuses or a workplace campus where incredible, horrible tragedies have taken place, and they therefore mark the experiences that people have about life and their worldview. Also, when and where shortage supplies happen, as I mentioned, the gas shortage, but also where there are places where there is excess, and people don't have any limitations, and they might live in a different country or live in a different era in time or live in a different part of that country or in a different family where one family has more money than another family does. And so one family never lacked for anything, and another family, having anything was incredibly significant and special for them. And so you can see that that's part of the challenges that will happen within an organization is you have all these different people that have all these different perspectives and worldviews, and trying to get them to work together in teams within an organization. They're going to have, sometimes there's going to be conflict that has to be resolved and worked out. All right. I mentioned a little while ago that there are two primary models that we're going to look at here in week one regarding organizational communication. And the first one is transmissional communication. It's a transmissional model. And so, here's what we need to know about the transmission model of organizational communication. It's pretty simple and it's pretty straightforward. You use it all the time, every day. For example, if you're sending a text out to your friends, or if you're on Twitter and you're sending something out there, or on Facebook, there's a source, okay? In the case here on the PowerPoint slide, you'll see that I'm saying a supervisor, but it could be your basketball coach. or your band teacher, or your mom or your dad, or you communicating to your younger siblings about being ready to go when you come by the house to pick them up, right? So there's a sender that is the source of that message, and then there's a message. And the message is usually task oriented. There's something that you're communicating or being communicated to you that needs to get done, something needs to get accomplished. And then there's a channel or a mechanism, a form of communication. Could be a text message, could be an email, could be a phone call, could be an old fashioned letter with a birthday card with some cash in it, hopefully for you for your birthday, right? Um, and then beyond the channel, then you have a receiver. The receiver could be one person, or it could be millions of people who are receiving a message and trying to gather and collect and receive information that is being transmitted, right? So in the transmission model, the idea is that a task needs to be completed by someone or a group of people or by millions of people on the receiving end of the message. One great example of this is how important it is, even though this model is so simple, can be applied during a serious weather crisis or a natural disaster of some kind. It's so sad. A few years ago in Northern California, there was an entire town with the name of Paradise. So, right, like so sad, huh? Here's this town that its actual name was Paradise, and a fire swept through it, and the town literally went up in smoke. The entire town burned down. Lives were lost, homes were lost, pets were lost, livestock was lost. And in the middle of all those other losses, people lost their homes. Many of them lost their jobs because their job, if they worked at a local business or bank or restaurant or motel or something that was in the area, it's gone. So your job is gone. And so many people moved away permanently. I know of a pastor that lived in Paradise at that time, and he actually moved to somewhere in the southern part of the United States because the entire town was gone. There was no more people to pastor in the community because many of them moved. And it was a terrible tragedy. So, in the middle of that crisis, what needed to happen? Well, the transmission model was applied. Word had to get out fast that without time to give people long explanations or bring a committee together or a task force team to discuss this and debate the the merit of everyone being asked to leave their homes, there wasn't time for that. The transmission model, it was okay, and it was important that it be one sided. We're getting this information to you as fast as we can to avert a disaster. So we're encouraging all of you to flee your residences immediately. And so the source in that case were the first responders, the fire department, the police department, city officials, anyone, neighbors, anyone and everyone that was a first responder. Can you imagine, old grandmas and grandpas that don't get around very well, and people trying to get to their homes and help them evacuate as quick as they can from their residence. The message itself was flee now. Let's get out of here. The channels of communication were radio, TV, door to door, and flyers being put on car doors and car windows and people's front porch and so on. And the residents were, I mean, the receivers were the residents of the community, the residents of the homes and the places of business and work. The transmission model was a critical communication tool that was used to rescue people and their pets, their livestock, and to keep anyone or any animal from dying in their homes or in their yards. Secondly, we're going to look at the constitutive model of organizational communication, and you can see what I've written down below that as a definition for this. The constitutive model invites social interaction / dialogue in a process that produces and even reproduces meaning as interactive communication takes place and evolves. And as I said, it is many times cyclical. There is a backward flow where information is recycled so that information can be improved upon and become more thorough. So unlike the straightforward transmission model, which is mostly task assigned communication, the constitutive model invites social interaction, dialogue in the process that produces and even reproduces meaning as interactive communication takes place. In your textbook, I might even tell you what page, but in your textbook, you'll see it in your reading throughout this course, is this: a view of communication as a process that produces and reproduces meaning as dialogue continues to move forward and recycle. So very, very different than transmissional model, right? All right, now there's a term I mentioned earlier, and is a term called requisite variety. And in a nutshell, requisite variety, try to say that back 5 times, says that organizational communication systems need to match the complexity of the organization's need to sustain success over time. So let me give you an example. If one person purchases a hot dog stand in New York City and they set it up out there, or in Chicago, two famous places where they have hot dog stands, right? And by the way, two very different approaches to what goes on a hot dog between those two cities. If one person is, meaning just one individual, is running one hot dog stand in New York City, he or she can keep the organization communication system pretty simple, right? I mean, I got to remind myself to get up on time. I've got to remind myself to keep my supplies stocked up. I've got to remind myself to get my marketing tools, whatever I need to keep it protected while I'm out there, my security system, my cash exchange, or if I'm going to use Apple Pay, whatever it is I'm going to do, can be pretty simple. I'm running one hot dog stand. However, let's say that Sally's hot dog stand just takes off. I mean, her hot dogs just are the bomb, and everybody wants to come to Sally's hot dog stand in New York City. And before you know it, she opens 2, then 3, then 5. She's eventually got 20 hot dog stands, and they're not even just in one borough of New York. They might not even just be in the city of New York anymore. Well, now Sally needs a much more sophisticated communication organization system that will be needed in order for her sustained success over a long period of time. So one researcher, Robert Craig, sees the constitutive organizational communication model actually as a meta model. And we're going to look at that now. So here we go. Craig's 7 domains, some scholars or researchers refer to them as the 7 traditions of communication theory. And as I said earlier, he proposed this in 1999. And in essence, there are 7 different ways of how communication works within organizations and within interactions among people. Some scholars refer to them, as I said, as 7 traditions. And each one of these brings a different perspective, a different form, a different type of communication. And so by gaining an overview of these 7 types of communication, we can better determine what best fits the situation that we have at hand. So think about it. If you're a contractor, you don't just have a hammer and a saw. You have to have all these different tools. Well, by the same token, if you're a professional communicator within an organization, you have to have various tools, and they don't all fit every assignment. Well, it's the same way with organizational communication tools. So this is certainly true within the different scenarios that will come up throughout the days, weeks, months, years, and decades with an organization, and even how it is communicating to the community, nation, or even globally. So let's tackle each one of these 7 domains that you see here, one at a time, and let's look at it. So the first one is the rhetorical communication. This is a practice of oral and written communication to convey understanding, meaning, and connection. Again, either from person to person, or in groups, or an entire organization. Communication, rhetorical communication, is theorized as oral and written. And you're going to see that early. That's going to be in your first week's textbook here, chapter 1. And it's an art, poetry. Some people are really good at writing poetry, and they can put so much meaning into that. They can have you imagining being at that location and experiencing something. Authors who write books, some of them are so skilled that they can actually have you picturing yourself out in the middle of that boat at sea by yourself in the fog, maybe being circled by sharks, and you find yourself even anxious inside while you're reading the book, let's say. Um, but whatever the scenario, when people are really good at the art or the craft of rhetorical communication, people have entire careers based off of it. Sometimes people that started in one career become so good at rhetorical communication that they switch careers and find out that apparently I have a gift for writing or public speaking in some way. And so they move on to their encore career. Um, let's look at some simple examples of this. Public speaking is an example of rhetorical communication. Conversations between coworkers over lunch is rhetorical communication. PowerPoint lecture slides, like we're looking at right now, this is rhetorical communication. Group discussion. Your textbook that you're going to be reading is an example of rhetorical communication. Uh, let me give you one practical organizational workplace example. That there's a staff meeting, let's say, and you're on Zoom. And one person might be in Chicago, somebody else is in Los Angeles, somebody else might be in Florida, somebody else is in Seattle, somebody else is in San Diego. And they're all in this staff meeting, and they're discussing the pros and cons of a new curriculum that is being assigned to the students for this coming school year. And they're deciding between two primary textbooks and which one's going to be the best one. And they're looking at the pros and cons of that. Okay. Now let's look at the next one, and it is semiotic communication. Symbolism is semiotic communication. And it's a fantastic way to communicate organizational values, purpose, vision, and goals. I'm sure many of you have heard the phrase that a picture paints 1,000 words. Well, that's an example of semiotic communication. It's theorized this way, that you're communicating meaning, deep meaning, significant meaning, and you're doing it through symbols. Symbolism is a fantastic way to communicate sometimes. Sometimes you can reach somebody with a picture or an image that you might talk for an hour and never really reach that person. But all of a sudden they see an image of something, and it triggers something for them. And now it comes through. Many lecturers, teachers, professors really believe that if you can connect an image to a principle or a concept, that it makes it much easier for the recipient, for the student, to connect the dots between the concept and the image. And they remember it that way much better. Okay. So let's look at some examples of this. Company logos, church logos, business brand symbols, religious symbols. What are some of, as Christ followers, what are some of the symbols that have a lot of meaning to us? The cross. I wonder sometimes how many people that are actually wearing a cross that we see out in society even understand the meaning of it, because it's such a common ornament to wear. But as Christ followers, it means much more to us, doesn't it? What about a nativity scene or the image of an empty tomb? As Christ followers, we know, hey, that reminds us that Jesus did not stay in the grave, but 3 days later rose. The nativity scene reminds us of the birth of Christ, where Emmanuel happened. God came near us. God stepped into our reality to communicate to us in a very personal way, right? So even just the incarnation of Jesus into our lives not only has a lot of symbolism, but it was actual communication where he became a human being so he could communicate with us on a very natural territory and ground. An example of this would be, let's say you're on a team in your company and you're designing and then you're going to market a new symbolic logo and maybe a tagline motto that goes right underneath it or beside it somehow that best communicates the purpose, vision, values, and goals of your church or your organization. All right, let's go next. Now we're looking at phenomenological communication. Yeah, say that one a few times to get it down. I used that word a lot when I was going to graduate school because that's the type of research that I did for my capstone. Phenomenology is this: it is understanding through direct experience. Um, it is one thing for someone to know somebody that has children. It's a whole nother thing for a woman to have a child, to also be pregnant for 9 months. There is something that she experiences in that process that she didn't know before. And the only way she could gain that knowledge is to go through that experience. You hear that all the time. I'm a grandfather, as I said, and it's the best season of my entire life. It's I can try to explain it to people how cool it is to be a grandparent, but until you are one, it's you really can only get it once you actually experience it. And it's a sense of otherness. Phenomenological communication is experiencing life in some way or another that you're connecting now with other people, with other human beings. It can be as simple as a group of friends or family going camping and sitting around the campfire. And they're sitting there at night and they're hearing the popping sound of that fire. They're feeling the cool air around them. They're smelling the campfire. Maybe they're even roasting marshmallows and eating those with making s'mores with them. And you're trying to keep your child from running away in the dark over here, and you're trying to keep your dog from barking in the middle of the night. And all these different experiences while you're also just laughing and hanging out together. And when someone experiences that quality of interaction around a campfire, it does something to you and you want to experience it again, right? What about also just sitting there and staring at the stars? You might be with other people or you might be by yourself. You ever gone and sat at the beach and had both, where you have a campfire and you're staring at the stars? And there's something about that, even if you experienced it by yourself, that the next time you want to bring your friends with you or your family, right? So you guys can experience it together. That is an example of phenomenological communication. It is experiencing otherness. This form of communication focuses on the actual experiences of people. So now let's apply it to an organizational setting. Different people have different experiences, and that creates a POV. It creates a point of view. And our point of view broadens when we have experiences together. So if you as coworkers both together experienced either a pay raise or a pay cut, all of a sudden there is a communication that happens in this phenomenon of otherness, of going through something good or bad together. When we have limited experience with something, our further or our next experiences take us further into understanding and thus it broadens our point of view. Let's look at an organizational example of this. Your coworker says that for them, going for a walk after lunchtime or during lunchtime really helps their brain stay sharp in the afternoon. Because maybe you guys were having a conversation like, I'm so tired after lunch. And you're trying to think of ways where you can be more into it and more engaged in the afternoon, so you don't face plant, at your desk or your workstation. And so you decide, hey, they just told me that this is what they experience when they go for a walk during lunchtime. I'm going to try it. And you do it a few times, and now you have experiences that potentially could broaden your viewpoint, your point of view on whether or not the phenomenon of going for a walk during lunch actually gives you less brain fog. The next one we're looking at here is cybernetic communication. And cybernetic communication is primarily information processing through technology. This form of communication is almost always goal oriented. There might be examples of it not being, but for the most part, it's goal oriented. And it's theorized as information processing. This form of communication, it could be something as simple as there's a sender, there's a message, there's a channel, and there's a receiver. And because we're sending out a mass email that's letting everybody know we have a Zoom staff meeting next week. And so we're going to find all these different ways to send it out. And so all the different forms of, you know, interactive communication within the organization could be applied. It could be, anything from LinkedIn to Facebook to text messaging to leaving post-it notes, whatever it is. But the post-it note era really is prior to the cybernetics, okay? Because you might have somebody again that is in, uh, you know, France. I have been in cohorts, learning education cohorts, where 3 or 4 of the people in a 12-person cohort are not even inside the United States, and they're waking up or going to bed at a completely different time than the rest of us are. And so an example of cybernetic communication would be finding optimal ways to set up a communication network system for employees to communicate while they're not all in the same location. All right. Now we have the socio-psychological communication. There's some $25 words in this first week's lecture, isn't there? This form of communication is about the expression and influence of relational interaction. It's expressed, it is influence. Have you know that in communicating for you, even by taking this course and by you going and pursuing your bachelor's in organizational management, you're going to attempt to influence people. And because you're people of integrity, you're going to influence them toward making good decisions. You will also be influenced. You're being influenced right now, hopefully, to get a good grade on this class, and also to learn something in the process of this course. And the example that I'm going to use for this one is using knowledge about personality and interaction styles to help maybe 2 employees at work that have conflict over something. It may be over generational conflict. It may be cultural conflict. It may be subcultural conflict. It might be gender conflict. It might be one person's shows up early and the other one's always late conflict, right? So there are a number of ways, but you're helping them by looking at the personalities and certain interaction styles, and you're trying to bring about healthy communication. So that is socio-psychological communication. Now we're going to look at socio-cultural communication. This is theorized as the reproduction of social order, or creating social order would be another way of saying it. You're working to create a healthy social process of communication that is going to significantly recognize and value the national, the ethnic, the multinational, and even the subcultures within all of those cultures mentioned that are affiliated with the organization. So they might be your employer, might be employee, might be coworkers, might be customers, might be suppliers. It might be the network in your marketplace, and it might be your customers. All these different scenarios that can come up. And I want you to notice something. There's a passage in the book of James that says it is important for us to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. How do you think that might positively impact Jesus's communication to us about how we are to socio-cultural interact with one another? Everybody I've ever met wants to feel like they are truly heard, that they're not just noticed. You want to be noticed, but you want to feel like you're heard. You want to feel, if you feel heard, many times you feel valued. If you can tell that someone is just waiting to say what they're going to say next while you're talking, you don't necessarily feel heard, right? And so sociocultural communication is doing the hard work, but the important work of making sure that people are heard. Okay. An example of this would be the collaboration for improving workplace realities for international workers that are making products for American companies. And so they're in all these different parts of the country, I mean, different parts of the world, making a product for American companies to sell to Americans, let's say in our situation here. And how do we help them? You know, how do we help make sure that their workplace is safe for them to do their job? That there's not abuse going on, that there's not bullying going on, that there is not unsafe practices happening either socially or even physically. There's a responsibility, I believe, that American companies have to do the best. They can't make another country behave a certain way any more than your parents were able to make you clean your bedroom all the time when you were a kid growing up, or maybe your own kids trying to get them to do the same thing. But trying to influence it in a positive way is a responsibility, I believe, that American companies do have. And this kind of communication is known as one example of outsourcing and the labor needs and the labor costs that are involved for other people. Okay, our last slide here is on critical communication. This is communication that is theorized as the primary objective being emancipation. So something unethical, maybe even illegal, usually something that borderlines on being immoral or it really is immoral, that is going on within an organization. Could be sexual harassment, could be bullying, could be really unsafe physical practices. Maybe it's a warehouse and the employees are continually being put at risk because the company doesn't want to spend the money to get better safety precautions or better equipment for the employees to use. It might be a machine that they need to purchase, or it might be to change the environment altogether that the employees are in. An example of this kind of communication would be confronting the issues of bullying in the workplace by designing and then implementing communication strategies that are aimed at conveying new or newly established cultural norms within the organization. Simply by maybe the strategic leaders from multiple levels in that organization all coming together and they have one question they're supposed to answer. How do we thoroughly communicate that we will no longer tolerate workplace bullying within our company? All right. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this process, and we uh, sorry about that. Look forward to all the coming weeks. We are in week one of 8 weeks in the process. And students, let me pray for you right now. In Jesus' name, I pray for a great week. I pray for physical health. I pray for mental health. I pray for physical capacity and mental capacity. I pray that all the other issues and restrictions that are on these students that might in some way try to become obstacles that prevent them from being able to go to school, from them being able to be successful at completing their degree. Lord, I pray over their finances. I ask that you would supply their needs richly according to all of your riches that you have for them in your kingdom. And Lord, I also pray that they would have joy in this process of learning about organizational communication because everybody wants to feel heard, wants to feel valued, and wants to know that they are mattered. Bless you, students. We'll see you online. Bye bye.